Okay, well, we're studying chapter 7, and we're going to try to do 16 verses today, but I want to tell you, I've told you this before, nowhere in the Bible does it say that God wants you to be happy. Now, on the surface, you say, that can't be true. I looked. You know, if we're going to be happy, happiness is a fleeting thing, even whether you're saved or not. Your joy is complete if you're a believer in Christ. But even then, your happiness can come and go, right? One day you're happy, one day you're not. So I just want you to remember that as we go through these verses today. Nowhere in the Bible does it say God wants you to be happy. The first, chapter 7 is about issues of marriage and singleness. Topic near and dear to the hearts of some of us in here right now, as a matter of fact. The first 7 verses are general principles concerning marriage. All right, let me read the first half of the first verse. Now for the matters you wrote about. Now for the matters you wrote about. We've been covering matters Paul heard about. You know, he heard about things, so he wrote about them in this letter. Now we're dealing with things that people wrote to him about. He's heard things in this letter with their questions. It will be clear that he has shaped his response to the theme of marriage and singleness. For they most likely did not ask about anything in Paul's response. He's got this whole thing. They wrote him a letter. We got these questions, and he got a fairly comprehensive thing. It's not completely comprehensive. We'll see why as we go through it. But he deals with the things they ask, and then he also included some things he wanted them to know. He answered their questions, but to answer adequately, he had to include some more information. He discerns their need and responds accordingly. They've written this letter. That's what they ask, but they probably need to know something else to make it a complete answer. It's not comprehensive. It's not a comprehensive response on the subject of marriage and singleness. His response is more pastoral and theological because it's based on actual situations that they ask about. But he does provide insight into some matters not addressed anywhere in Scripture. There's some things in here that are kind of surprising when you get right down to it. We'll see there are sections on married and single with matters related to believers and non-believers. He addresses sexual matters, and he also addresses those contemplating marriage, single people. The centerpiece of the chapter is to remain as you are. He says remain as he says our preference is for you to be as I am, but he also says to remain as you are. Now that is kind of puzzling, and we don't really understand that until we get to verse 26. Let me read verse 26 to you. He says, because of the present crisis, I think it is good for you to remain as you are. The present crisis, he doesn't talk about that up to that point. He's just given all these guidelines and discussions about various things. Then he says, because of the current crisis, we're going to find out maybe what that might be when we get on into this. But he had a reason for the things that he's saying. Unless Scripture directs us, here's what you need to know. Unless Scripture directs us to, we will not speculate on specific situations arising in the church. You will not believe how many pages I had to read to get these 16 verses covered because of all the various interpretations and translations and things that are in these scriptures. The guy would say, well, he probably said this because of that. I'm saying, when I say probably in there, I'm saying it's going to something else, because his probably is going to be somebody else's, maybe so somewhere else. So we're just not going to get into that. We'll never get through it. Also, various translations use words which can be read as more restrictive or less restrictive, or more positive or less positive, just depends on how you interpret various translations. So, but the result of the discussion is going to be the same. Regardless of the translation, even though you look at it and you say, that is weird. My Bible says this and this other one says that. I said, that's strange. But when you get right down to it, the conversation ends at the same place, regardless of what your various translations say. So we'll see that as we go. Let me give you an example. Looking at the last half of verse 1, my Bible says, it is good for a man not to marry. Pretty clear. I mean, you got to know what comes after that. Okay, there's a lot of stuff that comes after that, but that's what mine says. I've got the 1984 version of the NIV. Wayne has, I think, the 2011 version of the NIV, and that says it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Is that what yours says? Okay, now if Blake were here, oh, and also the ESV says that same thing. Well, yours, the 2011 version of the NIV. The New American Standard and the King James say it is good for a man not to touch a woman. That's a pretty wide range of different ways of saying things. But when you get right down to it and you go through the rest of the stuff, you see it all works out to be the same way. It's just that when you read these things, it conjures up different thoughts in your mind based on one translation over what another translation might say. It's good not to touch a woman. Okay. So, anyway, all of these examples carry the same meaning in view of chapter 6, where we were talking about sexual immorality and the verses following up to verse 1. Okay. This is one reason for marriage. In verses, in view of that, where he's talking about sexual immorality, marriage is a safeguard against evil. It's a reason for marriage, to avoid evil. You know, it takes away, should take away the sexual immorality aspect of daily life. Okay? It is to be used to avoid sexual immorality in a very carnal community. We're talking about Corinth. We've talked about rampant rampant immorality of all kinds. Sexual immorality. We talked about temple prostitutes, prostitution being a way of life. So it's rampant, you know, and they're used to it. They grew up with it. Paul he forms the church, and he's saying that's got to be part of the old life. But yet, what do you do about that? You know, it's still, we've always grown up with it, so what do I do? I also get married. I mean, he doesn't say it that way, but that's basically what he says. It will be a way to avoid sexual immorality. Furthermore, marriage is a distraction from serving God. We're going to see that as we go on. It's not that marriage is a bad thing, for we know it is a good thing. It's ordained by God. It's declared holy by God. But there is a consideration Paul gives to this topic of marriage that we do not ever hear about. You know, when we were studying, I think it was Philippians, I flipped over to this chapter to talk about various things, and I went to just a few key verses. And the key verses did not include the stuff that's at the end of this chapter. For example, verse 26, I read that to you. Verse 26 says this: because of the present crisis, I think it is good for you to remain as you are. Let me read verse 25, just to give you a little insight. Now about virgins. I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. I don't need to really discuss that. Remain as you are. It means what it says. If you go to verse 28. 28 says, "But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this." Now, you take that verse just like it is. It says, man, you can expect trouble if you get married. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking the exacerbation of troubles because of this present trial, the present crisis that he mentioned over in verse 26. There's something going on that you're just going to add to it if you get married. So let me keep going. Verse 31, no, was that 29? No, 29 says this, "What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short." Now it's starting to sound like Paul. Paul's about two things. He's about the gospel, number one, and the second thing, he's talking about the second coming of Christ being right around the corner. That's what he's talking about here. "What I mean, brothers, is that time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none." Then he goes on, so on and so forth. Then he says, goes to verse 31 says this, "For those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed, for this world is in its present form is passing away." So this present crisis, in Paul's view, is the second coming of Christ. You know, we've talked about that. He thought it was, and everybody else thought it was going to be in their generation, during their lifetime. And so he's saying that all of these things we're going to be talking about are going to add to your problems, because Jesus could come tomorrow or next week or next month, and it's just going to be a distraction for you. Okay, so let me go back and read the last half of verse 1 again. It says, first part says, "Now the matter you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry." So why is it good for a man not to marry? Look at verse 2. "But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband." That's pretty clear. You have your wife, I'll have my wife. You have your husband, you have your husband. It's exactly what it says, exactly what it means. Not much we can say about that, except Paul elaborates that on verses 3 through 5. Oh, there we go. Celibacy is to be practiced outside of marriage, but not within marriage. If you're not married, don't have sex. If you are married, it's okay. Second thing is, sex outside of marriage has come to be regarded as a right. In our life today, sex outside of marriage has come to be considered as a right. Third thing, marriage provides some relief from hot-blooded, the way I wrote it here, it's not in the commentary. Marriage provides some relief from a hot-blooded sex drive running full out in a culture where sexual immorality is rampant. Sex drive is one of the most natural functions God created man to have, and it's also one of the fiercest, strongest drive in his body. You look at the animals, and they do not care. When it's time for them when mating season starts, they don't care about safety. They don't care about anything. They care about mating. I mean, they will jump out in front of cars. I've seen them do it, you know. I've seen all kinds of things out hunting deer, being around deer, being animals. They just don't care. There's a drive in them. We're the same way, except we're probably not going to risk our life. Well, I don't know, we might. We might risk our life. But it's a fierce thing that is in man. But I will say that while it is a safeguard against evil, which I said a minute ago, God means much more for it than that. Paul said you protect yourself from sexual immorality by getting married. That's what he said in the first part. But God meant much more for it than that. He ordained it. He declared it sacred. It's a good thing. It is meant for pleasure. Pleasure comes out of it through through sexual relations. We wouldn't do it if it wasn't. I don't go around hitting my hand because I don't hit my hand because it doesn't feel good. Okay? So it's intended to be a good thing. And sexual relations bring a bond and the development of intimacy on both an emotional and spiritual level. I want you to think about that. There's a bond that forms through sex. The Bible said we become one. The man and the woman become one. Not because they're married. That isn't what makes them one. What makes them one is the act of sexual intercourse. It might add. I might add that this bond. I want you to listen to this. I might add that this bond is formed whether two people are married or not. If they're having sex, they're going to become one with each other. We talked about that earlier when we were talking about sexual immorality with the prostitute. The problem was they become one. Same with a man and a woman who are not married. When they have sex, they become one. And there's a bond that's going to be formed as a result of that. And it's an emotional and a spiritual bond that develops over time. So this is one reason sex outside of marriage should not be practiced. It's a dangerous thing. If a man is married and he has sex with a woman outside of marriage, the real problem, I mean, aside from it being contrary to everything written in the Bible, it has a potential for developing such a bond that it's going to cause a divorce. One-night stands are one thing, but lots of times if you know the person, it's not going to be a one-night stand. We talk about adultery going on over long periods, sometimes years. I told you about one situation in this church. It went on for 20 years. So it's a serious thing Paul's talking about. So let me read verse 3 and 4. These kinds of things make me sweat a little bit. Okay? If I was teaching teenagers, it'd really be bad. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. You don't hear many sermons preached on that anymore. My body, I'll do with it what I want. It's not what I believe. I believe this. So there's a duty within marriage which should be fulfilled. And what could that duty be? Before you answer, the literal translation of that is give back what you owe. Now it's even getting worse. It's my body. I'll do with it what I want. And the literal translation is, but you're to give back what you owe. So just think about that. What is the marital duty? Paul is talking about sexual functions. The Bible talks about procreation as one. No question about that. You go back to Genesis. He commanded that we procreate, that we populate the earth, right? That's one function for it. But he didn't say with anybody you can find. He goes on and says, which we're going to talk about soon, with your wife. The second thing is the development of a bond of intimacy. Jan, find Genesis 2:24. That's right.
For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh.
Marriage is what a man leaves his father and mother for. And the two become one flesh. Not because he left his father and mother, right? What is it that makes him become one flesh with this woman? It's the act of sex. It's their bond, their togetherness that comes with the act of sexual behavior they have. This can only happen through sex. Husband does not become one with his wife by being married. It happens only when they have sex. That is when they become one. The bond of intimacy happens during sexual functions, but the closeness that comes from that union should encourage intimacy in all other areas of life in the marriage. I mean, when you first get married, I'm sure, if I can remember back that far, there is a lot of discussion around the house about sex. And hopefully that never ends. But there's stuff that comes out of that that is more important. It's the bond that forms between a man and a woman. It starts there, and then it just the fact that you're there together, living out your life, sharing your mutual responsibilities with each other in the household, where bonds form, intimacy forms. All right, verse 4, let me read 4 again. I don't know if I read that or not. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but to his wife. So who owns your body? We talked back in not too long ago, just last week, maybe a couple of weeks ago. We know we were bought for a price by our redemption on the cross by Jesus. That was chapter 6, 19, 20. So he owns our body. There's no question about that. We talked about it in those terms. Here Paul says the husband owns his wife's body and the wife owns her husband's body. So Jan, I'm going to take your little body, I'm going to take you out to the yard and say, here's the lawnmower. It's not that kind of ownership, all right? It's not that. It's not master-slave relationship on either side. Okay, verse 5 says this. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul is getting down to it here. Anger. What's gonna cause you to deprive each other of sex? Anger will do it. Does anybody ever get mad in a marriage? I don't. Jan does a lot. I never get mad. It's a lot. You'll probably say, you never do. I'm sure it's always Becca that's causing it. Okay, well, anger can do it. It can cause deprivation in the bedroom. Deprivation leads to temptation. Temptation leads to sin. And so that any anger in the marriage should be resolved before the sun goes down. I could give you the scripture reference. I won't look it up. It means don't let your anger go on and on and on. What happens if that happens?
It festers.
It festers. You may find yourself doing something you thought you'd never do outside of your marriage. Paul says mutual deprivation is okay if you agree on it and for spiritual reasons. Now, you can take that for whatever you want to do. If you have a time of fasting, for several days, we're going to be apart. But he says don't let it go on. On the matter of deprivation, Paul says eventually the two should come back together, resuming sexual relations. Why? Why do they need to do that?
For the bond.
For the bond. But he says to keep Satan out of the picture. If you stay away from your wife and you have not mutually agreed on it, or you have other physical reasons or any other kind of reasons that prevent it. I went through the list. Temptation comes along. Temptation leads, deprivation leads to temptation. Temptation leads to sin. Sin leads to other things outside the marriage. So to keep Satan out of the picture, because of our lack of self-control, we may be led into sexual immorality. Did he say that or did I say that? Yeah. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Lack of self-control as it pertains to what? The woman at the office. The woman down the street. The woman on the business trip. And he deals with all that in Leviticus. Doesn't say business trip over there, but it would have if he wrote it today. So in verse 6 and 7 he says this. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift and another that. What he is talking about is he prefers being single, and he considers singleness a gift from God. But that does not mean that he doesn't mean marriage is not a gift from God, because he says it here. It is also a gift from God. Okay, verse 8 and 9 is some special things for unmarried people. Let me read verse 8 and 9. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. We're starting to get this idea that Paul is thinking that the only reason to get married is to save yourself from temptation from sexual immorality. Not to save yourself, you're always going to be tempted even if you're married, but to save yourself from sexual immorality. But there's more to it than that. All right. He says, talking to the unmarried, he means the never married, the divorced, the single again, the single again due to the death of a spouse, which makes it the widows and the widowers. That's who he's talking to here. Stay that way, as Paul is, single. But he goes back to the same issue for the married who have withdrawn from sexual relations and the lack of control. That's what he called it in verse 5. Because of your lack of control, he says, you need to come back together. Here, in verse 9, he calls it a burning with passion. Now, tell me what you think is going to happen when you put lack of self-control with burning passion. You put those two things together, what do you think is going to happen? Yeah, something's going to blow up. You got that right. He says you need protection. Not that kind of protection. You need marital protection from it. It's easy to see where burning it with passion coupled with lack of self-control gets you. It gets you adultery if you're married, and it gets you sexual immorality if you're single. That's the only two kinds of sex there is in Paul's mind. In the mind of the Bible, you got two kinds. You've got marriage, sex within the marriage, and sex outside of marriage. If you have sex outside of marriage, it's called adultery. If you have sex as a single person without being married, it's called sexual immorality. That's the only two kinds. Adultery and sexual immorality. And they're both sexual immorality, but we call them different things. We say adultery. All right. Oh, this is, okay, verse 10 and 11. To the married, this is to the married, the other was to the unmarried. To the married, I give this command, not I but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. I've got some clarification for y'all on this, because I've been confused about this, I guess as long as I've been older than 16 years old. To the married, I give this command, not I but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. God gives a command through Paul. That's what he says, not I but the Lord. It's coming from God through Paul. What is that command? The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, remain in that state. Why? It says it right there. to leave the possibility for reconciliation open. Once she marries again, what's the chances for reconciliation? Unless she wants to really cause another problem with the guy she married, they're not going to be able to be reconciled. He says the wife should not separate from him. The husband says no divorce from the wife. Separate words. The wife says do not separate from your husband. Husband, do not divorce your wife. Probably interchangeable words, separate and divorce. My comments, I can't, maybe it is interchangeable. You know, you say one or the other meaning the same thing. But at the same time, he said something different, and I don't know what it is. My commentary writers say that it's probably interchangeable, but I will say this, one commentary writer says that we should not consider them as we use them today. When he says separate wives, don't separate from your husband, he does not mean like we're having a trial separation. You know, that's what we're talking about now. We're having a trial separation or we're separated. It's not that kind of separation necessarily. And divorce probably is exactly like we talk about. You should not permanently divorce your wife. But for some reason, the words are different, but it probably means the same thing. That is what these scriptures say. But I want to go a little bit deeper because I think I would be remiss if I did not cover some other parts of the Bible on this topic, because this is different than everything else in the Bible. I think I can show you that. Deuteronomy 24:1. Very cool. You know it's going to be cool when we go back to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 24:1. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. That sounds like, now who wrote this? Deuteronomy. Moses. Okay, Moses was in charge. Moses went up on Mount Sinai, got the Ten Commandments, came down. This was not part of it. Everything after the Ten Commandments he got through revelation from God. He wrote it down because of that. This is what he thought God told him to say. For any reason, basically, you can get a divorce. That sounds a little different than what we think Jesus said. Listen to this. We got to get clear on some things here. What did he command? What he did command was that if a marriage were to be dissolved, it must be done legally with due formality and in a way that would protect the woman. This is what we just read. Moreover, the divorce was to be permanent. That's what divorce is. You know, if you go through divorce, the only way to undo that is to get married again. You have to remarry the same woman. The writing of divorce was what Moses commanded. A woman could not be dismissed from her husband's home by word of mouth. A written document was required. Now, here's the thing. You read that right there, and it makes it sound like all a man has to say is, I don't like the way you tie your shoes. You know, you don't bathe often enough for me. You know, you don't wear the right shade of lipstick. I don't like your cooking. Let's get a divorce. That's what it sounds like. Moses said there's only two grounds for it to be different than that. A man who falsely accused his wife of uncleanness was forbidden by law ever to divorce the woman. Falsely. He accused her falsely. The other thing is, if a man seduced a woman and the case against him was proven, he was compelled to marry her and was denied the right ever to divorce her. That's the only two reasons. Otherwise, it says, just because I don't like the way you tie your shoes, good and all right, you're out of here. Well, that's
perversion of
all of that, and everything I just told you is not what I understood Jesus to say. He preached the Sermon on the Mount, and he tightened that law up to him intensely. I want to read to you Matthew 19, Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9. I'm telling you this because Paul says something different than what Jesus said. That's why I'm backing up here. Matthew 19, 3 through 9. You all got it if you want it. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They said, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" That's what Moses said, basically. You want a divorce, you can have one. "Haven't you read," he replied, "that in the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And he said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." Well, that's pretty clear. Let's keep going. But that was way back there in Genesis. "Why then," he asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted," I want you to listen to this. Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard." It would be pretty hard to say, "Tina, I don't like the way you tie your shoes. I want a divorce." That takes a pretty hard-hearted person to do something like that. But it was not this way. I like the way you tie your shoes. I like the color too. I like everything about you.
I'm glad he's backing up.
Yeah, I like everything about you. Okay, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Pretty straightforward. Lest there be any doubt about it, the King James says, about what marital unfaithfulness is, the King James says fornication. So that's what we're talking about. That's the only reason for it. Now listen to this. Why is what Jesus said different than what Moses said? Or why is what Moses said different than what Jesus said? Listen to this. Jesus does not challenge their logic, talking about what the Pharisees said, only the permanence of the Mosaic law. God's provisions for divorce were temporary. What Moses said was a temporary law intended to be changed when Jesus comes. And he changed it. That is definitely a change from what Moses said. Based on the callous rebellion of the fallen humanity against God. He did not originally create people to divorce each other, and he therefore does not intend for those whom he recreates, meaning that you and me, the community of Christians, to practice divorce. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus proclaims a higher standard of righteousness for his followers than the law of Moses. So the intent was for Mosaic law to be temporary. Of course, they didn't know that. It lasted thousands of years. So what is temporary? Jesus changed all that. He said the only grounds for divorce is marital unfaithfulness. Paul didn't say anything about that. See, but Paul said nothing about marital unfaithfulness grounds for divorce. Can he change what Jesus said? Does Paul have the power to change what Jesus said? Because he did change it. He loosened it up again. Jesus tightened it up from what Moses said, and Paul's loosened it up by taking the marital unfaithfulness part out of it. The answer is no. Paul is responding to it. Remember, the very first thing we talked about. You weren't here. Let me tell you. Verse 1 of chapter 7 says, "Now for the matters you wrote about." He got a letter from them. And that's what has prompted all of this. All right? So he is responding to what was in that letter with specific circumstances, and maybe all I can say is this part about the marital unfaithfulness part of it just didn't apply to what they were asking. That's the only reason I can think of it wouldn't be. Does anybody have a comment about that or a better answer than that? But there is a difference. And anybody that would change what Jesus said, I think would have to be nuts if they think they could get away with that. We're going to go on to verse 12 now, but before we go on, I want you to know God wants you to be happy, I think. Nowhere in the Bible you missed this part. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that God wants you to be happy. And whether you are happy or not, if you are unhappy, that is not grounds for divorce. Moses, if the guy goes to Moses and said, look, I'm just miserable. My wife is crazy. I want a divorce. That is not grounds for a divorce. You may be crazy. You're not
That's
crazy.
your problem.
You're not really crazy. That does not nullify the holiness of your marriage. All right, verse 12 through 16 deals with a marriage between believers and non-believers. 12-13 say this. To the rest I say this, not I but the Lord, not the Lord. Not the Lord. If a brother has a wife who is not a believer, a brother has a wife, a believer has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, implying that she is a believer, and the husband is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. Yeah, this is one with the believer and not a believer when they get married. That doesn't leave open the possibility of divorce. That's not reason enough. That's pretty clear. If you go to verse 14 says this: for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through the wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. The believer cannot gain salvation through the wife. This says the believer sanctified through the wife. But he cannot be sanctified unless he believes on his own. But the need for salvation is apparent. He is not a believer. As long as the marriage is intact, there is to be a chance the believer can be saved. Don't get a divorce, there's still a chance he can be saved. Regardless whether you're the husband is the one that's saved or the wife is, the partner is not, the chance that the one who is not will be. Furthermore, the act of staying in the marriage, now I never thought about this, the act of staying in the marriage is in itself an act of sanctification for the believer. What is sanctification? We believe in progressive sanctification. Becoming more like Christ. If you can live in a situation like that where, now I'm taking away the potential for family violence, spousal abuse and those things. When those things enter into it, probably the answer is going to be different. There's no reason I'm staying. If my wife starts hitting me with a 2x4 while I'm sleeping, I'm probably not going to stay. So you just take that out of it. That's a completely separate issue. But to stay in a marriage where you're the one that's saved, your partner is not, your spouse is not, you'll become more sanctified. Unless you allow her to drag you down or him to drag you down, you'll become more sanctified. You'll become more like Christ just through the process of being a good example to him or to your spouse, whichever way it is. That's what I think. The other part I don't really understand. Children coming out of a holy marriage are holy. To divorce would make them unclean. I don't know all that. It's probably got something to do with the Levitical law, but that's just what it says. Verse 15 and 16 say this: but if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? The believer cannot initiate divorce. Okay? I'm a saved man married to an unsaved woman. I may not like the situation, but that's the way it was when we got married. It's not like I'm surprised to find that out. In fact, I made sure Jan was saved before I married. We were sitting out on a park bench one time. I presented the gospel to her. It's a good thing you answered the right way. But the thing is, you know the situation you're getting into relative to who's saved and who's not. You know, you love the person, or you wouldn't marry him. But that situation still exists. It's still there. The believer cannot initiate a divorce action. The last half of verse 15 says, God calls us to live in peace. All I can tell you is the Bible's full of it. We've got the Beatitudes. We've got this thing right here, self-abnegation. We're supposed to live in peace. That means we're supposed to give in more often than we might not otherwise. We're supposed to put the interest of other people first. We're supposed in the interest of living in peace, in the case where this happens. Divorce causes strife. You understand that, Ben? Divorce causes strife. I've lived through it myself. Jan's lived through it. Divorce is rough. It causes strife. Just the opposite of peace. By understating that, it's just the opposite of peace. Staying in the marriage may lead to the unbelieving spouse, may lead the unbelieving spouse to a life of Christian faith through the example of the spouse that is the believer. The believing husband, if he's not dragged down by an unbelieving wife, can be a good example to her where his lifestyle, the way he lives, can be an influence on her to the point where she gets interested in salvation, faith in Christ. And the other way, depending on which way you're talking, wife or husband. Exiting a marriage because you are unhappy, we're done here now, but exiting a marriage because you are unhappy is not grounds for divorce. I was going through divorce and had a person tell me that God doesn't want you to be happy. I mean, God doesn't want you to be unhappy. God wants you to be happy. I'm saying maybe not. You read about God's discipline. Nobody looks forward to God's discipline, but at the same time they appreciate it because it means they love it. He loves them. But it can be a pretty unhappy time for you. You experience that discipline. Right. We derive happiness through joy, but it's not constant happiness. It should be constant joy, but not constant happiness. It can't be constant happiness. You know, there's going to be unhappy. And if you happen to be unhappy with your wife, or your wife happens to be unhappy with you, it's one of those things you just got to live with it. Because times, it's like the Texas weather. Times will change. You know, it'll change. You live your life as a Christian man, it will change. She lives her life as a Christian woman, it will change. It's not grounds for divorce. Happiness is a fleeting thing is what I have here. Joy comes through Christ, and it leads to happiness, which is also fleeting. All right. That's all we got. We're going to be at